Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Compassion in Therapy Summit. My name is Kaylee Isaacs. I'm the founder of the Awake Network, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the summit, which is produced in partnership with the Center for Mindful Self-Compassion. As of this morning, over 59,000 mental health care professionals from over 90 countries around the world are joining in for this incredibly rich program over the next 5 days. So if you're joining in now, take a moment to introduce yourself and say hello. You can find the comments section or the chat section if you're joining in Zoom, and let us know your name and where you're tuning in from so we can get a sense of who's here with us today. We're delighted to be kicking off the summit with a live opening keynote on bringing compassion into therapy with Brach. It's going to be hosted by Kristin, Neff, and Germer. And I want to thank you, Tara, Chris, and Kristin for joining us. It's so exciting to see how compassion is being integrated into therapy. And this is such a precious opportunity we have today to learn from the three of you who have been such inspiring leaders, helping us bring more compassion into our world. So before we get started, I wanted to say that we'll have an opportunity for live Q&A at the end of the call, and I'll be giving more instructions on that later. But in the meantime, if you have questions that arise during the call, feel free to write them in the Q&A feature at the bottom of the Zoom call or in the chat or comments, depending on where you're tuning in from. So without further ado, I'd like to start by introducing Kristin Neff. Kristin Neff has a PhD in developmental psychology and is an associate professor of educational psychology at the University of Texas at Austin. She's a pioneer in the field of self-compassion research and author of the best-selling book, Self-Compassion. In collaboration with Chris, she developed empirically supported mindful self-compassion training program, and together they wrote the Mindful Self-Compassion Workbook and Teaching the Mindful Self-Compassion Program, a guide for professionals. Kristin's newest book will be released in June and focuses on how to balance acceptance and action. It's called Fierce Self-Compassion, How Women Can Speak Up, Claim Their Power, and Thrive. Kristin, thanks so much for being here with us today.
Oh, thank you so much, Kaylee. I'm so honored to be here and so excited to be with my good friends and colleagues, Tara and Chris. It really is an honor. So I'd actually like to introduce Chris to the audience. So Chris has a PhD in clinical psychology and is a lecturer in psychiatry at Harvard Medical School. He's been a psychologist for almost 40 years now, so he's got some experience under his belt. So in addition to our collaborative work that Kaylee mentioned on the Mindful Self-Compassion program, Chris is author of the Mindful Path to Self-Compassion, and he co-edited 2 influential volumes on therapy, which are Mindfulness in Psychotherapy and Wisdom and Compassion in Psychotherapy. And he's currently working on a book on self-compassion for shame, which is going to be great. So Chris maintains a private psychotherapy practice in Massachusetts, and he's also one of the core faculty of the 30-week Self-Compassion in Psychotherapy Certificate program that the Center for Mindful Self-Compassion is putting on, and that begins in March. And I'll hand it over to you, Chris, to introduce Tara.
Thank you, Kristin, and welcome to everybody from around the world, and deep gratitude to the Awake Network for putting this together. It's quite amazing. We are hugely honored to have Tara Brach with us today. Tara's work was actually a major inspiration for the Mindful Self-Compassion Training Program. When people learn to put their hand over their hearts like this in the MSC program, you can think of Tara Brach. She was the one who inspired us. And now there's even research being done on this, the physiology of it. Anyhow, Tara has a PhD in clinical psychology, and she's published 3 best-selling books, Radical Acceptance, True Refuge, and Radical Compassion. And for over 40 years, Tara has been weaving together the powerful traditions of Eastern contemplative practice and Western psychology, while guiding clinicians and students alike on the path to emotional freedom and emotional wellness and spiritual freedom. Tara is the founder of the Insight Meditation Community of Washington, D.C., and she's known worldwide for her popular weekly podcast, which is downloaded 3 million times each month. Mindfulness and compassion practices are really the foundation of Tara's work. And she has a special interest in bringing these tools to issues of social justice and compassionate action in our society. So warm welcome to you, Tara. So glad you're here.
Thanks so much, Chris. I just want to say I am so grateful, Kaylee and Awake Network, Chris and Chris, for you putting this on. It is such a juicy offering, and I can't wait to read your 2 upcoming books. So I'm excited to hear about them.
Thanks. Yeah, so maybe first question, Tara. As we know, mindfulness is now a mainstream paradigm of psychotherapy. Who would have thunk it, even 30 years ago? And compassion is following closely at the heels of mindfulness. And since you've been explicitly integrating compassion into your mindfulness work for decades, I'm just kind of curious, would you be willing to share a little bit about your own personal story of how kindness and compassion came to be in the foreground of your teaching and therapy over these years?
I'd be glad to. And it all came out of suffering. That, well, in college, I was really type A, a lot of striving and intensity. It was academic and social activism. I was on my way to law school, but it was also in my social life. Everything I did was kind of driven. And inwardly, I was anxious and depressed. And I just remember so clearly being on a hike with a friend who mentioned to me that she was now becoming her own best friend. And it totally clobbered me. It was just, I just started realizing how I was the furthest thing from. I mean, I just was so harsh with myself, so down on myself for being, too heavy, for addictive eating, for not being a good enough friend or daughter, just falling short academically, everything. And so it just became really clear that I was really stuck. And at the same time, and this is, what I call the trance of unworthiness, I was beginning to go to yoga classes. And I was also attending these kind of left-wing activist meetings and doing tenants' rights work. And at those rallies, there was so much anger towards the other side and hatred. And there's this growing contrast with doing yoga. So I remember one night after a yoga class, I was outside and in a park, and I paused, and my body and my mind were in the same place at the same time. And I realized, wow, I mean, there's so much peace in that. And I realized that the world we wanted to create, it's not going to come out of anger and hatred, towards ourselves or towards others. So I kind of made a sharp turn. And instead of going to law school, I joined an ashram, which really was a big kind of shift. But I really wanted to make peace with myself and open my heart to the world. And while I was in the ashram, I did a doctorate in clinical psychology. So I started, I was seeing clients, I was teaching, and I was weaving together what I was learning in yoga and meditation with psychological approaches that really, I think the way I framed to myself is we just need to love ourselves into healing. So during this time, I had a lot of fodder because my own hitting a wall again and again of feeling unworthy, and really all the people I was working with, it just became so clear that the core of suffering so often is this sense of not enough, I'm flawed, and it affects capacity for intimacy, and it affects how creative we can be at work, or it affects just relaxing in the moment. I remember one of my students sharing being with her mother while her mother was dying. And her mother came out of a coma at one point, looked her in the eye and said, all my life I thought something was wrong with me. And then she closed her eyes and she died. And those were her last words. And for this woman and myself, as I listened to the story, it just became so clear what a prison it is when we are caught in judging ourselves. So as I said, I started experimenting and exploring how to weave together mindfulness and self-compassion in a way that really could allow us to work with shame and fear and whatever came up. And it kind of culminated for me in the acronym RAIN: recognize, allow, investigate, nurture, which I continue to emphasize to this day when I get caught in an emotional tangle, because rain untangles. And so many people, especially during this pandemic, have said, well, rain saved my life. And I remember my motivation to actually write a guidebook on rain, and that my book, Radical Compassion, is actually a guidebook on rain, was that my mom, when she was in her early 80s, moved down to live with my husband and me. And it was at a time I was super stretched and anxious about all I was doing, and then guilty about shortchanging her. And some months in, I had this realization, I don't know how long I'll have her. And so I started practicing rain with my anxiety. And when it would arise and I had a chance to kind of take a little time out, I would, recognize it and allow it to be there and investigate and bring kindness, just tell myself, to trust the goodness. It's okay. Well, it gave me a huge amount more space with it. And over time, I found more and more I could be with her, and we'd be having our big salads and I wouldn't be wanting to get back to my computer, or taking a walk by the river and I wouldn't be watching my watch. And so she died just a few years after that. And I had a lot of grief about her passing, but I didn't have regret. And I realized that rain had saved my life moments with my mom. And I just share that because compassion continues to be at the center, and working with myself, with students, with others, because it's what softens the armor and frees our heart. So enough from me. I'd really love to hear a bit from both of you, because our experiences have brought us so much in the same direction.
Chris, you want to answer, especially because you're a psychotherapist. I'm just curious about how compassion came to be so central for you.
I'll only speak if you promise to speak afterwards.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah, so, well, depends how far back you want to go. Love and compassion was a big theme in my mother's life and hence in our family. But it really only landed for me when I went to India and learned to meditate. And I also spent a lot of time practicing devotion to God in meditation. And this was really transformative to me in my heart. And at the same time, I also learned mindfulness meditation. But it was only in my 50s, really 15 years later, that I started including myself in the circle of kindness and compassion, even a touch of devotion for myself. This was completely excluded from most of my practice until 15 years ago. And that happened also kind of out of my own personal despair, like you're talking about, Tara, And then for me, it was public speaking anxiety. For 20 years, I basically couldn't speak in public. This meeting, with 60,000 people would not be happening. But then I learned loving kindness meditation for myself, which I hadn't really been willing to do for any number of cultural and personal reasons. And that changed my life. That's when I recognized that we definitely have to include ourselves. And gosh, once I discovered that, everything started to become a bit clearer for me. Yeah. Kristin, I know you also kind of came to this through your own personal life.
Suffering.
Right?
Yeah, I think that's the way we all land here. Yeah, so For me, well, it also came through a practice of mindfulness meditation. I was very fortunate. The first place where I learned mindfulness meditation was with a group that followed Thich Nhat Hanh. And Thich Nhat Hanh is one of the teachers that really talks a lot about the importance of having compassion for yourself as well as others. And so when I first started learning mindfulness, actually, even before I knew how to meditate, I kind of got the idea that we could explicitly turn toward ourselves and try to be warm and kind and supportive to ourselves. And I was going through a difficult time. And like you, Tara, I was just blown away by the immediate difference it made in my life. I mean, mindfulness meditation took some time to get the swing of, but almost immediately when I started to speak to myself in this kind, warm, supportive language, it made me stronger, more able to cope. And for me, I suppose what really kind of drove home the power of self-compassion was when I talk a lot about my son, Rowan, because he's really my greatest self-compassion teacher. So Rowan is autistic. And it was the hardest thing I'd ever gone through, raising an autistic child, especially because I loved him more than life itself. And yet I had all these other feelings I thought I wasn't supposed to have, like disappointment, kind of guilt. Did I do something wrong? Just feelings of overwhelm. I felt like a competent person, but up against autism, it was like totally out of my league. And then so I turned to my self-compassion practice. And so when I felt overwhelmed or confused or frustrated, or, and I allowed myself to feel my grief, even though I loved Ron to death, I did feel some grief for, what I thought my parenting experience was going to be. And self-compassion not only helped me open to the pain and the difficulty of it, it did more than that. So it helped me get through the difficulty, but it did two more things. First of all, it gave me incredible strength and some equanimity. So that, let's say if Rome was having a really difficult tantrum, it would give me like a stable refuge to be able to hold myself with some calmness. And what I really found was so amazing about self-compassion, some people think it's selfish, or that, like we only have 5 units of compassion. So if I give 3 to myself, I'm only going to have 2 units left over for someone else. But I saw firsthand, it doesn't work that way. The more I could open my heart to myself and let the compassion flow inward, the more I could let it flow outward. And by the way, he's 19 now and driving and doing great. But Tara, I wanted to ask you, that I do research as well as teach self-compassion, and research proves you right. You got it right. We know that self-compassion is a really powerful mechanism by which people can heal from difficult states of mind like anxiety and depression or suicidal ideation. In fact, there's a lot of research that shows that in therapy, no matter what therapeutic modality people are using, it's the ability of clients to learn self-compassion that seems to be key to what constitutes effective therapy. But you also know that it's hard to be self-compassionate, right? A lot of people feel blocked, or they don't feel worthy, the trance of unworthiness or other things get in the way. And I'm curious, how you approach that as a therapist or as a teacher when people feel they aren't worthy of self-compassion, or that they distrust it in some way.
Well, it's a fantastic question because everybody that I know actually runs into challenges, and we have such deep conditioning to turn against ourselves. And especially if we've been wounded by others, by lack of care, we tend to internalize the way caretakers treated us and then treat ourselves that way. So trying self-compassion actually exposes all the ways that we're turned on ourselves. And often when I'm doing workshops or trainings in this, I'll invite people to bring to mind a situation where it's actually difficult to be forgiving or compassionate, and then ask them, well, what's stopping you? Really, what might be wrong about being compassionate? Or if you tried being self-compassionate, what might you have to feel that's difficult? And it actually helps to bring into consciousness some of the beliefs that people are holding on to and feelings. Beliefs like, well, if I'm compassionate to myself, I'll never change. Or worse, I'll actually deteriorate. I'll be worse, and others will reject me. Then, as you mentioned, I don't deserve it. I'm bad. I'm a hurtful person. Or for some, it's, compassion is indulgent. It's weak. I need to be accountable. And then under that, there are these feelings that make it really hard, that the biochemistry of the feelings is very different than the biochemistry of compassion, which is somatic feelings of shame and of fear, of anger. So we get really loyal to our negative self-beliefs, which sounds so weird, but it's easier to be hostile to ourselves than actually feel directly that raw experience of shame, of badness. So often there's some reminders, some truths that can help reframe this that I'll speak about, how deep the conditioning is to feel personally bad, how not alone we are in it. What you both described so beautifully as our common humanity, that so many of us are struggling with this. And also to talk about the paradox that Carl Rogers names it the best, that he says, it wasn't until I accepted myself just as I was that I was free to change, that transformations, the prerequisite is beginning to soften and hold ourselves with kindness. And then a big belief people get stuck on, and Kristin, I'd love you to speak more about this because it has so much to do with what you describe as fierce compassion, is that compassion is courageous. It's not weak. Roshi Joan Halifax has a wonderful metaphor that it's actually that we have a strong back and a soft front with true compassion, that it arises from mindfulness that very clearly sees what's happening. There's a clarity and an honesty and a truthfulness, and that gives us strength and an undefended heart. So we have that sensitivity, and together the strong back and the soft front creates a very healing, tender presence. So there's those domains of cognitive reframing. But the place that I spend the most time in terms of responding to the obstacles really is guiding in ways that'll help people have a healing somatic experience in their body, creating enough safety, like in the container that we have. So people can actually go into what's underneath the obstacle, the real rawness, and I use rain with that. So for instance, for one woman who was absolutely stuck in self-aversion for her parenting, and many people know if we feel like we're not parenting well, there's just no way to forgive ourselves. Well, she couldn't forgive herself. And so we did some rain where she would recognize how angry she was at herself and at her daughter, who was kind of sliding in her grades and smoking a lot of pot. She was in high school and they had a real standoff. But then she was mostly angry at herself for not really having been there more. And then she allowed it. That's the A of rain, which is like saying, okay, this anger is here. It's like a wave in the ocean. It belongs. Letting it be there, not trying to fix it or make it go away. And then she'd do the I of rain, which is investigate, where she could sense the belief, I'm falling short, but feel in her body, really investigate and feel what's it like when she felt she was failing as a mother, and to breathe with that. And sometimes I invite people to put their hand on their heart at that moment to actually begin the nurturing, just to stay with the experience with kindness. And what that does, staying with that incredibly unpleasant, vulnerable place, and this really is a vulnerability training, it creates kind of an ouch experience where people can kind of see how much they're suffering. And really the alchemy of compassion is to let ourselves be touched by suffering, including our own. And so for her, I asked her, how long have you been living with this feeling of failing? And she said, as long as I can remember. And she had this kind of sense of the landscape of her life and how many moments she had been in that prison of self-hatred. And that created some sadness. I think of it as a soul sadness. And then she was really able to nurture. She was able to put her hand on her heart and say, it's okay, I'm here, I care. You know, the words that she needed to hear. And what happens with that, instead of self-compassion being an obstacle, that this feeling of our own vulnerability and offering kindness actually enlarges the sense of who we are. And I call this after the rain, where we actually start resting in a larger sense of presence. So one last thing to mention on this is that when people have obstacles, it's really important to experiment with different pathways to nurturing, to self-compassion, because a lot of people think self-compassion means I have to offer my self-compassion, that it's compassion offered by a self. But sometimes our self feels way too regressed and too reactive to hold with compassion. We're too small. So part of customizing is exploring with clients, you know, where they have felt any sense of connection to some larger source, some larger being that cares about them. It could be a grandparent or a spiritual figure, their dog, a formless essence that's loving in the universe. And to whatever they have sensed some love from, to sense what they most need to feel from that larger source, what words, sometimes for people it's touch, as I've been naming, what images. And this actually, if they repeat it, builds a kind of neuro pathways of nurturing. And for me, I think this is most everybody I know, there are times that I just can't sense offering it compassion from my larger self to myself. And I remember once being stuck at a retreat many years ago and trying to comfort myself and realizing I couldn't. I felt like I was just too bad at core. And some very young place in me, I could feel the calling. It was like saying, please love me. And when I let myself open to that longing, there was a sense of this just very vast, tender presence, larger than I was. And I just imagined and sensed love and light washing through me. And it became as if this large presence was kissing me on the brow. And then there was kind of a dissolving and becoming that large presence. What I realized is that that presence wasn't outside me, but when I was feeling really contracted, I need a bridge to it. So many, many times now, when I feel small, I'll just imagine a sense of a field of light and love and it washing through me. And then the tightness in my heart dissolves. And then I realized, oh, that's who I really am. But I use that bridge. And I work with many, many people to help them find their own bridge to self-compassion. And it's such a powerful pathway. So, Kristin, I know you've done a lot of research on the obstacles and the beliefs, you know, the myths of self-compassion. So I'd love to hear from you, you know, what you've noticed.
Well, thank you, Tara. By the way, I just love your spiritual teaching. You're one of my favorite teachers, so that was very moving. But I'm going to be talking later in the program, and this is the only time the audience gets with you. So Chris, did you want to talk with Tara about presence? Because I know Chris is kind of building a model of how self-compassion works in psychotherapy. Did you want to ask Tara about presence?
Presence, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. We know, so first of all, I do want to just say, you know, what a beautiful teaching. I want to echo what Kristin was saying, and I was especially appreciating, you know, finding a bridge for people to connect with compassion, especially when we don't feel that we can do it. And so that's really the art of the practice. And it's also something that I think therapists can keep in mind. Yeah. Like what is the bridge? And I also appreciate that you were talking about the alchemy, you know, the alchemy of bringing kindness to suffering. This is really what compassion and psychotherapy is all about. And we've been talking about it in the past in terms of empathy, you know, but I think actually when therapists have been talking about empathy, they've been talking about compassion, they've been talking about kindness. They've been giving kindness for 100 years in the therapy context. And so what we're doing now is just sort of streamlining it a bit, making it live and breathe in the body, as you were saying. But I guess apropos the matter of presence, so we know that there are at least 3 ways of integrating compassion into psychotherapy. And this Awake Network program is actually organized along these 3 levels, we might say. The first is compassionate presence. The second is a compassionate therapeutic relationship. And the third is compassion-based home practices. And I, in particular, have really enjoyed I love your presence, and I just love to hear what you might also say about presence. How would you describe what you mean by presence, and also its role in cultivating a compassionate therapeutic relationship?
Yeah, well, thank you. And I love the question because the word presence has a lot of aliveness for me. Let me just start back with mindfulness, that a lot of us share a kind of definition of mindfulness being the awareness that arises as we're paying attention on purpose to the present moment and without judgment. So that's mindfulness, that awareness that arises. I think of presence as the embodied, felt sense of that mindful awareness. And embodied means a lot, because for us to really have compassion, that tender resonance with another, we have to be embodied. So presence is the kind of wakeful, tender, felt experience through our senses of mindful awareness. And in relating to each other, if we want to be in a resonance field, we have to kind of feel that sense of presence. It's the foundation of experiencing compassion, giving it, receiving it. I often think of, there's a evolutionary psychologist, Luis Cozzolino, and he writes that it's not the survival of the fittest, it's the survival of the nurtured. And that in parenting and therapy and loving relationships, that nurturing requires mindful presence, being able to be in our bodies. And the challenge that we have is that we're just so often not. It's like one spiritual master was asked to describe the world, and his description was lost in thought. And it's so interesting to me that when people talk about feeling compassion towards somebody or a situation, it's often mental. It's abstract, that we know somebody's having a hard time, but we're not enough embodied to actually feel caring. And others pick it up. Our compassion lacks transmission. It's not energetic. So I think of compassion training actually as vulnerability training, that we're staying embodied and letting ourselves be touched by our own and others' pain. And then we actively extend care. And I also think of there as being a real difference between empathy and compassion. Empathy has to do with feeling another person's feelings, and so does compassion. But compassion feels it with a real mindful presence. So we're not as reactive, we're able to be responsive. And compassion includes action. It includes our responsiveness. And in research on advanced meditators, it's so interesting to me that when they track what's going on in the brain, when monks are doing a compassion practice, there's activity in the motor cortex, a readiness for action. And they also have discovered that with empathy, it activates our limbic system. So we can get really burned out because it doesn't feel good. But with compassion, because there's that mindful presence, that strong back, that balance, that equanimity, combined with that sensitivity, there's actually activation in the frontal cortex. It's pleasant. it's evolution gave us that pleasant reward because it really serves our species to be compassionate. So because we dissociate regularly, because we kind of avoid vulnerability, it requires intentionality to cultivate that presence and that tenderness. There's one story of a sage. People would go to him with all their problems, and they'd have to go through all sorts of wilderness and challenging distances to get to him. And they'd bring their challenge, and he would swear them to silence. And he'd say, I just have one question for you. And that is, what are you unwilling to feel? And it feels to me like part of the path of compassion, and having that embodied presence is just to ask ourselves that, and know that we're actually giving ourselves a real gift by leaning in towards what's difficult, because it actually opens up a tenderness of heart that really frees our heart. And it allows us to then bring that tenderness to others in a way that can really be healing. So thank you for the invitation to talk about that, because I have a lot of passion about it.
Can I ask you a question though? So
Yeah.
I'm actually not a therapist. I'm a research scientist, and I teach self-compassion and workshops and stuff. And so maybe this is slightly from the outside, but what happens if, like, your client, I don't know, can I say this? You don't like them very much? I don't know, maybe they've got stuff going on, or they've got political views, or what happens if you find judgment arising? I mean, it's nice to say we're going to be full of compassion, but we're also human beings. And sometimes, it's like, I'm not feeling much compassion for this person. What do you do then? How do you use self-compassion and maybe compassion for others to work with that?
This is a fantastic question, because it's utterly relevant to like today, yesterday, and this year. And do I have permission to go on a bit on this one?
Yes, please.
I love this question because I lead a weekly group where people bring in their questions. In this last year, I'd say the most regular question that people wanted to explore was, how do we deal with our own judgments towards others that we feel are violent or violating or causing harm? How do we deal with our own anger and judgments towards them? So whether it's our client or somebody in the family that has a different political views, or somebody in the larger society, a key actor that we feel is harmful, how do we deal with the fact that our hearts are not feeling loving and open? And I feel like it's such an important question. Um, and first of all, it feels really important to remind ourselves and others that our reaction, what you describe, Kristin, towards a reaction of dislike or a feeling of blame or anger, is totally natural. Not only natural, there's an intelligence to it. Every emotion has intelligence. So the first step is not to try to be compassionate. It's listen to your own anger and judgment, listen to the message, and do what's needed. In other words, engage with the words and actions that actually will protect us and protect others. So not to skip over that and say, oh, I should be a compassionate person. If you feel someone is causing harm, listen to the message and respond, um, including make others accountable. And as my friend Ruth King says, our anger and judgment is initiatory, but it's not transformative. And so it's important that it's there. It initially helps us protect, but it doesn't move us forward into healing. Because here's the thing, we often stay stuck at that judgment anger phase. We don't move on. I love the words of James Baldwin. He says, I imagine that one of the reasons that people cling to their hate and prejudice so stubbornly is because they sense that once the hate is gone, they will be forced to deal with their own pain. And that is true for violent white supremacists. perhaps the ones invading the Capitol. And it's also true for any of us who lock down into anger and hatred and reaction, that it's easier to feel our anger than it is the vulnerability we might be feeling underneath it of a fear or powerlessness. And I often think of Martin Luther King. He taught a basic principle that is, I think, beautifully stated also in the Buddhist tradition, which is hatred never ceases by hatred, but by love alone is healed. This is the ancient and eternal law. So the inquiry here is really, how do we honor the anger? How do we take care of ourselves, but then not get stuck there? How do we move on to compassion? And there's so many stories. The stories that most inspire us are the people that move on. They're our models. And I'm thinking right now, some of you might remember this, that last June in Buffalo, there was a Black Lives Matters protest, and a 75-year-old man who was peacefully participating, and the police shoved him to the ground, cracked his skull, damaged his brain. Well, he was just interviewed recently because there have been all these comparisons between the police response to the protest and insurrection at the Capitol and Black Lives Matters. And so when he was thrown to the ground, a former president wrote it off as, it was a Tifa, he was faking his fall. So this elder was just interviewed, and the interviewer was bringing to him, look, what do you think about the contrast of the way the police treated you all back then and the rioting at the Capitol? And the interviewer brought up the video many saw of police holding a woman's hand at the Capitol, helping her down the steps. And I want to tell you his response. He said, there are a lot of misguided people in America. He said this of the rioters. You can't club every misguided person in America. You can't club them. And we might have different ideas about how to respond to this recent violence. Yet I think it's really important to note his capacity for such graciousness, such a good heart, that this man, this elder, still having a hard time walking and hearing, that hatred is natural, anger is natural. We have to honor them, but don't stop there is really the message for us. So the pathway, last things I'll say is the pathway. How do we move once we've taken care of ourselves from that judgment or anger towards a client or a person we think is causing harm in the world? And one of the biggest mistakes I feel people make, especially people on a spiritual path, is kind of premature transcendence. Like, okay, now I'm going to go and be compassionate towards that person. But it doesn't work that way. We have to start by bringing honest, mindful presence and kindness to what's actually going on inside us. And it's not until we've brought presence and compassion there that we actually can authentically, in an embodied way, include others. And an example in my own life, and I started this practice of not trying to forgive others right away, but trying to bring compassion inward when I was reacting with anger. I remember right before we attacked Iraq, and I've continued this since, that I was really angry at those who were seeming to perpetrate the violence, on how many people would be killed. I could just feel the ripples that were going to come. So I was really angry. So I asked myself that question, what am I really unwilling to feel? I brought the attention inward, and I could feel under the anger this fearfulness and this powerlessness about all the suffering that was going to happen. And then as I kept bringing mindfulness and care to that, I could feel underneath that fear was grief. I was really grieving loss. And underneath even the grief was caring. And if I could do that inward kind of presencing and get to my heart that cares, then there was that kind of soft front but strong back from presence. And I could then begin to bring to mind those who I felt were causing harm and really see their conditioning, just see they were operating off of their conditioning. I've seen how powerful this can be if we're willing to first go inward and be honest and caring towards what's going on in us. I saw it just a couple of weeks ago in one of the groups I had. A woman of color was talking about her blocked compassion towards white people, and how, she was feeling really a lot of anger towards her partner, who's a white woman, a Jewish white woman. Her partner was very upset about the focus of the holidays on Christmas, and she was feeling really intolerant. She was like, get over it. But it extended more generally, just anger at white people and their part in the violations of white supremacy. And she said, I know in my heart that people aren't personally responsible and that everyone suffers, but I'm just feeling this kind of block, this anger. And so I shared with her something I want to share with you all because it just struck me so much. This is Nikki Giovanni, who's a Black poet and teacher, in an interview with James Baldwin in 1973. And this is what Nikki says. She says, one of the nicest things we created as a generation was just the fact that we could say, hey, I don't like white people. And then that was the beginning, of course, of being able to like them. So I share this because if we honestly face our own experience underneath our armor, the dislike, and underneath that, the pain, and we do it with compassion, then that opens us. We process it. And as Nikki says, if we get it out, then something else can come back in. And many people skip that step, trying to prematurely be compassionate to others. There's one of my heroes is African-American social activist, Brian Stevenson. And people sometimes ask him, well, what about people that really don't deserve compassion? And, say the violent white supremacists. And I want to just let you know his response. He says, it's not about what they deserve. It's about what you want for your heart, a prison of hatred or the freedom of love. So thank you for letting me go on and on, because this is so alive and immediate. We so deeply need to bridge the gaps between people, but it doesn't happen just because we have an idea of being compassionate. We have to have the courage to first bring our attention inward.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. Amazing. Amazing.
Thank you, Tara.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm just really appreciating, particularly for this summit, bringing to our awareness that compassion training is vulnerability training, to turn toward the hard parts for compassion to be real.
Yeah.
Not just sugarcoating, not to do a spiritual bypass. And isn't that the gift that therapists are giving their clients all the time? There is a place where you can actually talk about what hurts,
Yeah.
And so if we're going to do compassion-based therapy, it's, in many respects, we know how to go to the hard places, but now maybe we can even have the added conscious skill of bringing kindness to ourselves in this process and helping our clients to do that as well. Yeah.
Chris, I think of it as a U-turn, that we're aiming our judgment outward and we make this U-turn to come back and just very gently feel into what's under it, so that we can do that inner clearing, come back to that strong back and soft front.
So I wonder, Tara, if you would be willing to lead us in the rain practice. While you were speaking, many people said, rain, what's that? I want to know about that. So maybe we can, would you be willing to do that?
Oh, it'd be my delight. I love doing it. Yeah, so the invitation for all who are listening right now is to find yourself a way of sitting, or a posture that is relaxed, comfortable, easy, also wakeful, that you can be awake. And sitting quietly, you might close your eyes or let your gaze be downcast and take a few full breaths. As you're breathing in, filling the chest and the lungs. A slow out breath, just letting go a bit. Again, breathing in fully, filling the chest and the lungs. Slow out breath, letting go, letting go. And letting the breath come back into its natural rhythm. You might gently scan the body and just notice if anything wants to let go a little more in your body right now to help you relax into presence. And then widening the scan, you might just kind of look at your life right now and notice if there's any situation that brings up reactivity that's difficult. Might be something that brings up self-judgment, fear, anger, perhaps something that triggers you in a way that you turn on yourself. Wouldn't bring up anything traumatic. It won't serve you for exploring right now. Maybe something to do with a relationship or conflict, where you turn on yourself, or working with a client and you're feeling in some way deficient, or something to do with your finances, your health. And whatever you have in mind, let the situation be close in so you can actually see a time it happens. See what's in the room, if there's another person involved, expression on their face or remembering their words, whatever triggers you. You might sense what the worst part of this is for you. RAIN starts with R, which is recognize what's happening. So as you reflect on the situation, just recognize whatever feeling's predominant. It might be anger, fear, distress, embarrassment. And it helps to name it with either a silent whisper, or even if you want to whisper out loud. When you name it, it actually begins to create that mindful awareness. It's naming whatever's predominant. And the A of RAIN is allow it to be there. And it's a willingness to just let be. I like to say this belongs, because it's just part of nature right now, your nature to have these waves in the ocean, let them be. And the I of RAIN is to investigate with a gentle attention, just bringing your interest, your curiosity. And you might again sense the worst part of this, what really you're afraid of or upset about. As you investigate, you might sense what you're believing, what's about to go wrong, what you're believing about yourself, about another person. You might be believing that I'm failing, or another person's going to reject me, or they don't care about me. But most important, as you investigate, sense what you're feeling in your body. You might check your throat, chest, your belly, as you sense the worst part of this, and just feel how it's living in your body. And if there's a certain place you feel it, you can put your hand there. It'll help you to keep your attention there and breathe with it. Just noticing from the inside out, what's it feel like? And it can be helpful to take the posture that expresses what you're feeling and even let your face express it. That'll help you get in touch somatically. When you're feeling angry or ashamed or afraid, your posture, your face, and then letting yourself feel in your body, where's the vulnerability the strongest? And can you gentle in a bit just to feel it and breathe with it? And let your touch, if you're touching yourself, if you haven't already, you might bring your hand to your heart. Let your touch be tender because you're beginning to nurture with that touch. Create a safety, a space for what's here. And you might sense the part of you that's feeling vulnerable, what it most needs. You might even say, how do you want me to be with you? And sense, does it want understanding, acceptance, company, reassurance of being worthy, lovable? And you might even sense what source might nurture this place, your own awake heart, or maybe some other. Maybe there's some sense of really wishing you could feel the presence of a friend that's wise and caring, a grandparent, spiritual figure. Sense what you long for, what might help and comfort and heal. And nurturing by letting yourself attend from your most awake and wise heart right now. You might offer a message of care. You're okay. You're enough. Trust yourself. I'm here and I'm not leaving. Maybe if it's fear, you might say, thank you for trying to protect me. I'm okay. Or maybe you're held in love. And if it's difficult to offer that from yourself, you might imagine that larger source. That love and that message and that tenderness is coming from that larger source. Just visualize it. Open yourself to it. Perhaps you can imagine love and wisdom flowing from someone you trust right through your hand into your heart. Or maybe it's from, as I described, a more formless presence, a vast or infinite field of loving, universal loving and light. Experiment and give yourself to that receptivity, letting in, letting love in, into the cells and the spaces between them, letting love wash through your entire being. And this final part, what I call after the rain, take some moments to sense the quality of presence that's emerged. It might be just a small degree of presence or very fullness of presence. In some way, more space, more tenderness, more openness, more freedom. Notice the shift from when you started as a fearful self or an angry self or a failing self to really resting in this larger presence. Trusting that this loving presence is more the truth of who you are than any story, you could ever tell about yourself. Thank you for your willingness to go inward. Thank you.
Yeah, that was very beautiful. It's funny, I'm often leading practices and I don't actually do them, but I did that one. I was dealing with the parenting mistake I had made, and it was just amazing how all the layers of that unraveled. And then when you opened to the bigger consciousness and love, it was very beautiful. So thank you.
Yeah.
And I know we have a lot of people who would love to ask you some questions, Tara. And I think Kaylee, are you coordinating that?
Yeah, so I'll just share a little bit of information with the folks watching about how we'll go about the Q&As. And thank you so much for that practice, Tara. So as we move into the Q&A section, we're going to be taking a couple live questions from those of you joining us on Zoom. And so if you'd like to come on and actually ask your question with your audio and video enabled, then we're going to ask you to write your question in the Q&A function at either the bottom or the top of your screen, depending on which sort of device you're on. And that's different than the chat function. So at the beginning of your question in the Q&A area, write live in all caps, and that'll let us know that you have a functioning microphone and camera. And then write your name, where you're from, your professional specialty, and finally your question. So we'll be looking through those to choose a couple people to come on. And if we choose your question in about 5 minutes, you'll hear me call your name, and then you'll be brought on live right away. So please be ready. And at that point, a window will pop up asking you to enable your camera and microphone, and you're going to click yes, and then you'll be on. So over the next few minutes, go ahead and write in your questions. And in the meantime, we have a question that has come in written form that we'll start with for about 5 minutes till we turn to the other questions. So this question is from Sue, and Sue writes in, I also wondered if you could talk about how compassion and boundaries work together. I heard Brené Brown talk about her research and how the most compassionate people have solid boundaries. So we'll get started with that, and we'll hear from some other folks in a little bit here.
I guess I'm starting to respond. It's true that very compassionate people have boundaries, because boundaries are wise. They really are there to protect and serve us and others from harm. And it kind of brings me back to the strong back and the soft front, that if we don't have that kind of courageous presence where we can see truth, speak truth, be aligned with truth, then just having a soft front will leave us liable for harm. So it's really the combination. And the reason that mindfulness is so powerful is it allows us to see clearly with ourselves and another person what's needed. We can very honestly say to ourselves, okay, is it causing more suffering to be in close to this person, or to be available to this person, or to allow this person to behave this way? Or is it actually something that's serving our relationship? We can see more clearly. And that is the inquiry over and over again. Does this cause harm, or is this serving awakening? And that's the inquiry behind the strong back. And that's what enables us to then have a less defended heart. We can draw all the boundaries in the world and keep our heart open. So I'm really grateful for the question, because it's always misunderstood. Compassion's so often thought about as, oh, we just drop all our boundaries and let people walk all over us. And that's not what it is.
Thank you so much, Tara. Looks like we have our first question coming in from Julio Briones. So Julio is a psychologist. Julio, you're going to be seeing an option to enable your video and audio. Go ahead and click yes, and we'll be bringing you on to ask your question. So it might just take a moment for them to get him set up. Let's see. Okay, it looks like Julio, we can see you, and it looks like your audio has been enabled and your video.
Excellent. Thanks very much. Thanks very much for this training, everyone. My question was for Dr. Brach. I work with oftentimes Native students, and I was curious if you've ever used the RAIN technique, if you will, to heal or process intergenerational trauma.
Thank you for that one, Julio. And please call me Tara. Everybody calls me Tara. Yes, so much trauma is intergenerational. You know, it's like trauma is passed down. There's more and more research showing how it's passed down. So often, regardless of the source, the process is actually the same of bringing healing, which is that we have to create enough safety first. Safety is the absolute key thing, and it's particularly so with populations that have been vulnerable and been oppressed. I mean, the genocide and the terrorism of Indigenous peoples, Black peoples, you know, it's all intergenerational. So the first step always is, what's going to create enough safety to begin to even do a healing process? And that means what will create a container where that person feels like they're grounded, they have a way to come back into the present moment, because with trauma, we get catapulted into a place of feeling like we're immediately under attack. And so I spend a lot of time on what's called resourcing for safety. And I know you're probably familiar with it since it's so much part of the field. But I think it's one of the skills that most of us therapists can refine, which is helping each person to asking that question to each person. If I was asking it to you, when do you feel safe? What helps you feel safe? What people, what place, what words, what images? And then once you have, and even people that have been traumatized, there's some tendril of experiencing some sense of safety. All we need is a tendril, and then whatever you practice gets stronger, which means if you can guide that person over and over to, you know, bringing to mind, it may be one of their spiritual beliefs or images, it may be a certain person, until they really know how to anchor themselves in that, then you can begin to go to where the vulnerability of the trauma lives. So that's, I mean, there's so much more to say, but it feels like intergenerational trauma is the name of the game. It's in all the vulnerable populations and in more people than we know. And it's still the same process of finding those anchors of safety that offer enough stability so we can begin to touch into the trauma, but have a way to come back without getting re-traumatized. Does that resonate for you?
Very much. Thank you very much for your response and time to answer my question. Thank you.
Well, thank you for asking it. Yeah.
Thank you, Julio. So we have a second question here from Stacy. So Stacy, we're going to be asking you to come on live now, and you want to click enable when it asks you for your video and audio. Click OK. Looks like you're coming on, and we can see you, but it looks like you need to enable your audio and video still. Hi, Stacy, welcome.
Hi, so my question is for Tara. Really honored to be here with you all. My question is a personal one. I'm a psychotherapist, but this is a personal question for me. I often find that I can't actually feel love or nurturing in my body. Like there's a block against it, or I simply don't know what that feeling feels like as somebody who has, you know, a lot of trauma in my history. So I was wondering if you can talk a little bit about how to help people or support people who seem to not be able to easily let the love and nurturing in and can't really feel it in our bodies.
So is the question about letting love in, or feeling it towards others, or both?
Feeling it in our own bodies for ourselves. So the last part of rain, I often can't feel it in my body.
Yeah. Can you feel that loving towards other people?
Sometimes.
Okay. So I think you named the challenge really well, which is the more there's trauma, the more dissociated we are from our body. And it's the healthy response when we're young. And then the question is, how do we get less dissociated? And I'm wondering for you, what you have explored to help you re-inhabit your body in general.
Yeah, I can feel the pain and suffering really well. I
Yeah.
can stay with that and bring presence to that. I just get a little lost when it comes to the love and nurturing.
So you can, in your own life, feel for yourself the ouch, the suffering you've experienced. And if you look at, your life, the kind of the landscape, you can sense a sadness about that, or where do you go?
Yeah. Mhm.
Yeah. That's your entry place, is to, and what I found really is helpful is if, let's say right now you're aware of how much the trauma's affected your life, like what it stopped you from experiencing that matters to you, what would you say?
Relationships,
Yeah.
love, connection, closeness.
So it's really deprived you of that. And then when you look at and say, how long has that been true for? How
I'm
long have you felt?
I'm 42, so
So for
about
your life, so you felt unable to feel close to others.
not entirely, but
To the degree you have felt that, because I can tell it matters to you. Like you wouldn't be bringing this up, and we have all these people unless it really mattered to you. And I can feel your sincerity about that, and that touches me. That it's the real pain is the pain of separation. So for you to just when you can to let yourself look at your life and see, just even as a young child and onward, not just the deprivation of that and the sadness about that, and just simply let yourself feel it and breathe with it, and just go through the motions of sending the message you imagine would be the message that would be helpful, and trust that going through the motions actually is really, really effective.
okay, because I always feel like I'm just going through the motions.
Don't worry about that. But the more you contact the vulnerability and then go through the motions, the more there'll start to be a tenderizing.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for a question that I know many, many people feel. Yeah. And blessings, dear. Take
Thank
good care. Yeah.
Thank you, Stacy. So we have a third question. This might be our last question here from Hani Chabo. And Hani, we're going to be bringing you on now. So when you see the option to enable your video and audio, click yes. Looks like you're here with us. And just waiting for him to enable his audio. Hello, Hani. Oh, it looks like your audio is enabled, but we can't hear you for some reason. Let's see. Oh, still can't hear you. So if it's okay for you, Hani, I have your question here, so I'm going to read it for you since we can't hear you. I have a question about a tough case. A man who accidentally ran over and killed a man who was overdosed on alcohol and drugs and crawled under his car. He finds it impossible to find forgiveness and compassion towards himself. I'm wondering how you would help work through a blockage like that.
Yeah. Thank you, honey. And it's a heartbreaking example. And, it doesn't help always to say it's not your fault when somebody's, and I know you understand, when somebody so deeply, it's almost like it would be too painful to let go of the blame. The blame is almost what keeps them from feeling they're salvaging some sense of their humanity. So in a way, it can be helpful to have them imagine and sense themselves as a child, are some at an earlier phase of their life, and that was holding something like that, a child that had done something and was holding it, and so that they can begin to get a little larger perspective on themselves. Either that, or have them see it through the eyes of somebody that loves them. And it takes, either one of them is trying to open them to a larger vantage point. And it'll take real practice to get that person to look through another person's eyes, but that'll help them to begin to see that it wasn't their fault. Because I know in my work with people that it's when the point that they can start getting a little bit of a break from their own vantage point, and then I say, it's not your fault, then they start actually being able to create a new reality. One man who was very angry and hurtful out of his anger, when he was finally able to see how his father did the exact same thing, and that shifted it. And this one is so clearly not his fault, but he needs to have a different vantage point. And I'm feeling like that's an incomplete response. I wish we had more time with it, because so many people are caught in the prison of not forgiving themselves. So best wishes on your work with him, and thank you for bringing it in.
Thank you so much.
And thank you to each of you. Those are very beautiful questions. I'm thinking of yours, honey, and just courageous questions. So really beautiful. Yeah.
Thank you, honey.
Thank you.
So I see that we're just about at our time for ending the call. And I just wanted to thank you so much, Tara, for sharing your wisdom and your big heart. And thank you so much, Chris and Kristin, for hosting the call as well. And I just wanted to see if there's any last statements you'd all like to make before we close today.
Tara?
Oh, I'm just, okay, go ahead, Kristin. Go ahead.
No, I was going to say Tara, but Chris and Tara, you each could say a little thing.
Well, I was just so moved by this last hour, and I learned so much, and I just really appreciated the way Tara embodies so much of what we talk about in compassion-based psychotherapy. And it was just a beautiful start to what is coming up, which is an extraordinarily rich summit with so many people. So much gratitude. And to everybody around the world who's been with us. Thank you.
Well, I'm really so glad you're doing this. And I deeply, deeply honor, Chris and Kristin, your work and bringing it all forward so much. It feels to me like compassion is this built-in human capacity that actually we can cultivate, and that it's the medicine the world most needs. So whatever we all can do, all of us, and you listening, you those who are part of this, we're all part of this wave that is really, really precious and necessary on the planet. So a deep bow to each. Thank you.
Thank you. And especially to the audience, you really are part of a movement. So thank you so much for showing up.
Well, thank you again. And for those watching, the evening sessions will be becoming available in just several hours at 7 p.m. Eastern time. You'll be able to find access to those on the Summit homepage, and just really looking forward to the next several days with all of you. Thank you, Tara, Chris, and Kristin, and everyone watching. We'll see you soon.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.